Imagine being a boy no older than 7 or 8 years old, standing barefoot on the uneven stones of a Balkan village street, the winter air biting into your skin, and the sound of hooves and boots approaching in the early dawn. You don't yet understand why the village is awake before sunrise, why mothers are clutching their sons tighter than usual, or why strange men in uniforms are unrolling lists with names written in a script you cannot read. What you do know is that in the span of minutes, your life will change forever. This was the reality of the Ottoman child levy, the devshirme system, which reached into homes and villages, pulling children away from families, faith, and names, and placing them into the machinery of an empire that stretched from Hungary to Arabia. Most were destined for the Janissary Corps to become elite soldiers. But a smaller, quieter group of boys would vanish behind the doors of Topkapı Palace itself, entering a world few outside ever saw, a world of silence, ritual, and control, the life of the male concubines. From the outside, the palace was the crown jewel of the Ottoman Empire. Marble courtyards gleamed under sunlight, fountains trickled in carefully designed gardens, and domes glittered against the horizon. To foreign visitors, it was the image of wealth, refinement, and stability. But behind the lattice screens and locked doors was a system that reshaped children into instruments of obedience. The first thing stripped away was identity. A boy called Andre or Nikola in his Christian village would be renamed, perhaps Mehmet, Ali, or Salim. He was circumcised, converted to Islam, and told that his old self no longer existed. His language was forbidden, his memories unwelcome. From that moment forward, survival meant forgetting who he had been. Inside the palace schools, indoctrination began immediately. The boys were trained in etiquette, how to bow, how to walk without sound, how to stand for hours without moving a muscle. They were taught literacy and calligraphy, drilled in memorizing verses and recitations, and given lessons in music, poetry, and dance. But none of these were gifts for their benefit. They were tools for control, instruments that ensured the boys could serve silently, gracefully, and without question. To outsiders, a concubine might appear refined, educated, even privileged compared to the life of poverty he had left behind. But for the boys themselves, every detail of training was another chain tightening around the neck. Surveillance was constant. The black eunuchs, themselves victims of a brutal system, acted as both guardians and jailers. Castrated at a young age and trained into positions of authority, they controlled access to the sultan's harem and oversaw the concubines with an unyielding eye. A glance from a eunuch could mean silent approval, a warning, or the beginning of punishment. Privacy did not exist. Every word, every gesture, every interaction was monitored. Friendships were discouraged, bonds severed, letters from home forbidden. The boys lived in an atmosphere of watchfulness, where even silence could betray them. Discipline defined daily life. Mornings began before dawn with washing and prayer. Then came tasks, sweeping corridors, carrying trays, reciting lessons, practicing movements until they were second nature. The palace was a place where even the smallest actions had rules: how to fold garments, how to set cushions, how to hold a lamp so that the light illuminated a superior's face perfectly. Mistakes were not met with loud anger. They were punished quietly and efficiently. Food might be withheld. A posting might change suddenly to a colder, harsher space. A boy who spoke out of turn might simply disappear, his fate whispered but never confirmed. This quiet, impersonal punishment was more terrifying than open violence because it showed how replaceable every child was. Imagine the psychological toll of this life. A boy who once fell asleep to his mother's lullabies now lay awake in a dormitory surrounded by dozens of others, all of them pretending not to hear each other cry in the dark. A boy who once ran freely through fields now learned to anticipate the needs of men who never looked him in the eyes. He carried trays, bowed when commanded, and stood still for hours, his body aching but his face impassive. Survival meant silence. Survival meant invisibility. The palace taught him to erase himself until he was nothing more than a reflection of power. But power loved to dress cruelty in beauty. The boys were sometimes clothed in silks, adorned with jewelry, made to look like ornaments of the Sultan's magnificence. They were paraded before guests as proof of the empire's wealth and control. To foreign diplomats, the concubines were simply another feature of the palace's splendor. To the boys themselves, the silks were shackles, the jewels reminders of the lives stolen from them. They learned to smile when ordered, to play music when commanded, to conceal the storm that raged inside. Luxury became a mask for suffering, a gilded cage that glittered to distract the world from the lives being consumed within. And yet, in such a suffocating world, there were moments of fragile hope. Stories circulated among the boys, rare tales of concubines who rose to positions of influence, who became scribes, officials, or trusted advisors. These stories spread like contraband sugar, sweet but dangerous. They kept boys awake at night, whispering to one another about the possibility that obedience might one day lead to freedom or at least to power. But the reality was harsher. For every concubine who rose, countless others faded into obscurity, discarded once their youth and beauty were gone, their names erased from records, their lives forgotten. The Ottomans justified this system as practical and symbolic. By taking children from conquered lands, they secured loyalty stripped of old allegiances. By reshaping them in the image of the palace, they ensured absolute control. Concubines were not only companions, but tools of domination. Their existence was proof that the Sultan's authority extended beyond armies and taxes. It reached into the very flesh of conquered families, twisting sons into servants, ornaments, and shadows. This was power in its most insidious form, the power to take a child, erase his past, and remake him into silence. Whispers about the lives of these boys did escape the palace, carried by diplomats, travelers, and occasional chroniclers. Some spoke in hushed tones about corridors where silence was so heavy it seemed to press against the chest, where young attendants moved like shadows, and where every step was choreographed into invisibility. European envoys wrote about the splendor of Topkapı, but between the lines of admiration, one can detect unease, the sense that behind the glittering curtains were lives sacrificed to maintain an illusion of order and magnificence. These accounts, however, were rare and often distorted, leaving modern historians to piece together fragments of truth from scattered records. What becomes clear, though, is that the male concubines were part of a deliberate system that blended grandeur with cruelty. Inside those walls, rituals shaped every hour of every day. The boys were drilled in the art of standing still, in learning to anticipate the desires of superiors, and in the subtleties of expression. Never too much, never too little. They practiced music not for joy, but for performance, poetry not for inspiration, but for display, dance not for freedom, but for discipline. Their value lay in their ability to embody refinement while suppressing themselves. The palace demanded not just service, but transformation into symbols of submission. The concubines were living ornaments of power, reminders that the Sultan could command not only armies, but the very identity of children taken from distant villages. The guardians who oversaw them, the eunuchs, were figures both feared and pitied. Castrated in their own childhoods, they became instruments of the empire's will, enforcing rules with precision. To the boys, they were both captors and protectors, men who had suffered the same theft of youth, yet who perpetuated the cycle of control. A eunuch's silence could be more terrifying than his words, and his approval more valuable than gold. The boys quickly learned that survival depended on reading every nuance of these men's expressions, on anticipating their moods, on adapting instantly to their expectations. Life under their gaze was like walking a tightrope over an abyss, each step measured, each breath calculated. Food, too, became part of control. Meals were simple and regulated. A boy who pleased his superiors might receive a little more. One who faltered might find his portion cut. Hunger became both a punishment and a lesson, teaching the children that even their bodies were not their own. Sleep was similarly rationed. The boys lay in dormitories where every movement was observed, where whispers were dangerous, and where dreams of freedom dissolved at the sound of footsteps approaching in the night. Rest was shallow, haunted by the fear of being singled out, by the knowledge that mistakes were remembered long after they were made. For some boys, the greatest torment was isolation. They were surrounded by others, yet forbidden from true friendship. Attachments were discouraged, bonds broken, trust undermined. They rotated postings frequently enough to prevent deep connections, ensuring that no two children could grow into brothers or allies. Loneliness became a constant companion. In the silence of long nights, boys remembered the voices of their families, the laughter of siblings, the smell of their homes. But each year, those memories faded, eroded by the palace's insistence that the past did not matter. What mattered was obedience in the present and silence about the future. Occasionally, a concubine might be elevated to a position of greater responsibility. A boy with a sharp memory might become a scribe, recording the endless paperwork that flowed through the empire's bureaucracy. Another with a gift for discretion might be assigned to accompany envoys or officials, carrying messages or observing negotiations. Rarely, a concubine's beauty or composure might draw the sultan's favor, bringing temporary privilege. These cases, however, were exceptions, and they served a purpose: to maintain hope. Stories of elevation spread among the boys, whispered like fairy tales. They suggested that obedience might be rewarded, that suffering might one day lead to power. Yet for most, these were illusions, dreams dangled just out of reach to keep them compliant. The psychological scars of this life were profound. Children raised in captivity grew into adults who struggled to form attachments, who feared freedom as much as they desired it, who carried the shadows of the palace wherever they went. Some accepted their roles, becoming lifelong servants of the empire, unable to imagine a world beyond its walls. Others longed for escape, but even if released, they found themselves strangers in the lands they had once called home. Their languages had been replaced, their identities rewritten, their families long lost. They belonged nowhere, caught between the empire that had consumed them and the villages that no longer remembered them. The palace itself reinforced this sense of captivity. Its architecture was designed not only for beauty, but for control. Narrow corridors funneled movement, lattice screens obscured vision, heavy doors muffled sound. Every space reminded the boys of boundaries, where they could go, what they could see, whom they could serve. Gardens, fountains, and courtyards appeared to offer tranquility, but to the boys, they were stages where obedience was displayed for visitors. The beauty of the palace was not for them. It was for the empire, a mask to conceal suffering, a stage set to convince outsiders of the empire's refinement. Some outside observers recorded glimpses of these contradictions. Venetian envoys described the opulence of the Sultan's court, but in private letters, they hinted at the unease of watching young boys move like phantoms through the palace. A French traveler noted the silence of the attendants, the way they seemed to appear and vanish like ghosts. These fleeting accounts confirm what the empire tried to hide, that behind the grandeur was a system built on the stolen lives of children. Why did the empire create such a system? Part of the answer lies in control. By taking boys from conquered lands and reshaping them in the palace, The Sultan ensured loyalty untainted by old ties. By stripping them of names, faiths, and families, the empire created servants who belonged nowhere else. The concubines were not only companions, but instruments of domination, living symbols of the Sultan's ability to bend the world to his will. Their suffering was the empire's display of power, proof that it could consume even the most intimate parts of human life. As time passed, some concubines disappeared into the machinery of empire, their names forgotten, their stories erased. Others found small measures of influence, serving as clerks, advisors, or attendants whose proximity to power gave them a fragile authority. Yet even these roles did not free them from the shadows of their past. They carried with them the memory of isolation, the sting of punishments, the weight of lives lived in silence. The palace never truly released them. It lingered in their minds like a shadow they could never outrun. For us today, these stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths. We admire the domes of mosques, the beauty of Ottoman calligraphy, the symmetry of gardens and palaces. But beneath that splendor were children stripped of their humanity, turned into instruments of obedience. To celebrate the empire's achievements without remembering the cost is to repeat the trick it played on visitors for centuries, distracting with beauty while concealing cruelty. The concubines' lives remind us that history's brilliance often hides shadows, and that behind every monument may lie voices silenced too soon. The longer a boy stayed inside the palace, the harder it became to remember the world beyond its walls. Seasons blurred into one another, measured not by the rhythms of nature, but by the schedules of ritual and discipline. Spring was marked by festivals he was allowed only to serve, not to enjoy. Summer came with the heat of courtyards where he still had to stand in silence, sweat soaking the fine fabrics that looked elegant but felt suffocating. Autumn was not the harvest he once knew in his village, but the arrival of new boys, frightened and confused, their faces mirrors of the fear he had once felt. Winter was not the hush of snow, but the sharpness of discipline, the quiet reminder that no matter how many years passed, the palace owned his body and his silence. As the boys grew older, some began to see glimpses of futures that might be possible, though none of them promised true freedom. A handful might be reassigned into administrative roles, serving officials who value discretion and polish. Others might be granted minor responsibilities in the harem, trusted to deliver messages or guard secrets. A very small number could rise into influential positions, their obedience and refinement earning them places near the machinery of power. Yet these rare ascents only highlighted the fate of the majority, forgotten when their youth faded, replaced by the next generation of boys brought in through the same system. The palace was not a family, but a machine, and machines do not mourn what they consume. The stories of individual concubines rarely survived, but fragments remain in whispers recorded by outsiders. An Italian traveler spoke of a boy with eyes so vacant it was as if his soul had been locked away. A Persian envoy described the eerie silence of attendants who never seemed to breathe until spoken to. A rare Ottoman register noted the transfer of young servants to obscure posts, with no further mention of their lives. These fragments remind us that behind the statistics and rituals were human beings, each with a name once spoken by a mother, each with a childhood stolen in the name of empire. They were not faceless ornaments. They were children forced into silence. The architecture of Topkapı itself reinforced their captivity. Walls rose high, shutting out the city beyond. Windows were narrow, allowing light but not vision. Doors opened only when commanded, and behind them, corridors twisted like a labyrinth designed to confuse and contain. The palace was beautiful, yes, but its beauty was a weapon. Gardens and fountains soothed visiting eyes, convincing outsiders that this was paradise, while the boys who tended them lived in carefully measured captivity. The contradiction was the point: splendor masking suffering, silence hidden behind music, cruelty cloaked in refinement. To understand the lives of these boys is to confront the empire's philosophy of power. The Ottomans built greatness not only on armies and trade, but on control at the most intimate level. By shaping children into instruments of obedience, the empire demonstrated that it could dominate not just nations but identities. Each concubine was proof that the sultan's reach extended into the very fabric of human life, bending it to his will. The boys' suffering was not incidental. It was a display of power, a reminder that even innocence could be consumed for the sake of empire. We cannot ignore the psychological cost. Many concubines carried their trauma long after leaving the palace, if they ever did. Some never escaped the shadows, living as silent servants until their deaths. Others, thrust into unfamiliar roles outside, found themselves unable to connect, unable to love, unable to trust. They had been raised in a system that punished attachment, that demanded silence, that erased identity. Even when the doors opened, many discovered that freedom was a word they no longer understood. They had become strangers to themselves, and the world beyond the palace had no place for them. There were, of course, exceptions. Men who found influence, who navigated the corridors of power with enough skill to secure positions, wealth, or recognition. But even they bore the scars of their upbringing. They might sit in rooms where decisions were made, but inside, they carried the silence of dormitories where boys once cried in the dark. Their rise was not proof that the system was just, but evidence of how deeply it had penetrated their souls, shaping them into tools of empire, even as it rewarded them. The palace could grant power, but it never returned what it had taken. The concubine system was a paradox of visibility and invisibility. The boys were always present in the palace, moving through its corridors, standing in its rooms, serving at its tables. Yet they were invisible as individuals, their identities erased, their voices silenced, their names forgotten. They were ornaments of obedience, visible only as symbols of the empire's strength. History itself has nearly erased them, leaving only faint traces in archives and memoirs. Their invisibility was both their role in life and their fate in memory. For modern audiences, their story is a warning. Splendor can hide cruelty. Power can disguise suffering. Empires can write their own histories, emphasizing domes, gardens, and victories while erasing the voices of those who paid the price. To remember the concubines is to resist this erasure, to insist that behind the brilliance of empire lies the shadow of human cost. It is to give back, if not their names, at least the recognition that they lived, that they suffered, that they mattered. And so, when we admire the beauty of Ottoman architecture, the intricacy of calligraphy, the refinement of courtly ceremony, we must also remember the silence of boys whose childhoods were consumed behind those walls. Their lives were not accidents of history, but deliberate products of a system designed to control. Their suffering was not incidental, but essential to the display of power. To honor them is not to deny the empire's achievements, but to see them clearly, without the veil of splendor, without the distraction of beauty. History demands that we look both at the domes that shine and the shadows they conceal. This is the horrific truth of the Ottoman male concubines. Boys torn from their families, stripped of their identities, remade into instruments of silence, displayed as ornaments of power, and forgotten by history. Their stories are not easy to tell, but they must be told. For in remembering them, we resist the empire's attempt to erase them. We restore humanity to those whom power reduced to symbols. We bear witness to lives stolen and voices silenced. If you have stayed with me through this story, it is because you understand the importance of uncovering hidden truths and giving voice to the forgotten. Don't let their stories vanish again. Give this video a thumbs up so that more people can see it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all, and your perspective matters. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey into the shadows of history. Your support helps us bring more hidden voices to light. Until next time, keep questioning, keep discovering, and keep history alive.